Yeah, I have a question. What in your mind, given all that you have written now and spoken and the many forums where you've addressed aspects of this, what do you think is the process of confrontation that the United States clearly has undertaken to either overthrow the Chinese government or slow its economic development or shape the next stage of its development? What is exactly happening in terms that I know large portions of the world fear as a step-by-step approach to nuclear war?
Well, there is a bipartisan agreement in the United States that China needs to be challenged, both in terms of technological sanctions and in terms of a military encirclement. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have demonstrated that. Trump 1.0, the first Trump administration, was quite mild. They imposed some sanctions on aluminium, on various commodities, and that was more or less it. And tried to find a way of dealing with Beijing. It was Biden that turbocharged the new Cold War. He was elected as the anti-Trump, and yet he was the one that, with the CHIPS Act, effectively he told Beijing, you are not going to be allowed to become a technologically advanced country. Now, that didn't work. You can see already, take the last Huawei phone. It really didn't suffer. I mean, there was a period of 1.5 years, which is nothing, of a contraction in technological development in that part. But look at DeepSeek, look at AI now. Chinese AI is going in leaps and bounds. So, look, Trump is far less belligerent than the Democrats. And the way he conceptualizes this, having spoken to some of the people in his administration, which, just stating that, I hope you understand the pain it causes me to have these discussions. But nevertheless, they were very interesting conversation. It seems to me they're fairly relaxed about China compared to the Democrats, which might surprise the vast majority of people out there. The way that the Democrats conceptualized the geopolitical chess game as a NATO versus particular enemies of the United States. China, Russia, and all of them at once. So it was a multilateral thing. The idea was to coordinate constantly with Europe, and with Australia, and with Japan, and with India to encircle China militarily, and also in terms of sanctions, trying to bring down Chinese big tech, what I call Chinese cloud capital. Now, Trump understands that that doesn't work. He doesn't want, it's in his character, he doesn't want to have to talk to Keir Starmer and to Merz in Germany and to anyone. He wants to do it himself. He conceptualizes the world as a bicycle wheel. So there's a hub in the middle, and that's Trump. And then there are the spokes. The spokes can be China, Germany, India, Russia, and so on. And he wants to deal with each one of them separately. So he slaps 25, 30, 40%, 50% tariffs on everyone. He doesn't believe the tariffs will do the trick. But the tariffs are there in order to signal to every spoke, you have to come to me and you have to deal. And he will demand, he's already demanding different things from different spokes. So from the Japanese, he demands that they convert their dollars into whatever. From the Germans, he demands that BASF and Volkswagen shift their capital to the United States. From the Chinese, he doesn't have that many expectations. If he can come to a deal, he will. If he doesn't, he will have high tariffs. He knows that the Chinese economy, because it is so dynamic, it can sustain quite high tariffs. And that simply becomes a revenue for his federal government. And if he manages to find some kind of accommodation with a China-centric world, which doesn't challenge the hegemony of the dollar, I think that he would do it. Now, of course, as we know, inside every administration, that's not different to the Trump administration, there is a conflict. There are still the military-industrial complex folks who are pushing him to strike at Iran, to maybe cause a conflagration over Taiwan by shifting nuclear missiles there, supposedly to protect Taiwan. But then there is, there are the doves within his own administration that want none of that, and that just want to cut a deal with Beijing. We don't know who's going to prevail on this. What we do know is that, since I'm speaking from Europe, that the one continent which is so screwed is Europe. I don't need to explain this.
Thank you, Yanis. I really appreciate you virtually traveling for a long distance and sacrificing your bedtime for us.
I didn't sacrifice anything. It's fun being with you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Yanis. I think you can go to bed.
Now I'm going to listen to Rick and to the rest until I fall asleep. If you see me nodding off, just excuse me. Okay?
Yeah. So I think Yanis raised a very interesting and pivotal question about socializing cloud capital and socializing the technological innovations we have there. And Wolff, you are very prominent Marxist and also a Marxist economist. So that is what I call a very rare thing, because we haven't seen so many Marxian economics breakthrough. We have a lot of Marxism philosophical breakthrough. We have people like Slavoj Žižek. We have people like Badiou who make breakthrough in the philosophical theories, but not so much in economic theory. And I think we can borrow your lens in in how you're inheriting the Marxian, especially American Marxian economics legacy to explain what is happening today in China and America. And I'm particularly interested how you and your theory may help us understand what Yanis is saying, how to socializing the capital without, I would say, going too fast into central planning economy.
Okay, well, let me begin. A couple of introductory remarks. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am familiar with the building in which you are holding this, since I was both a graduate student and a professor at Yale for a while, earlier in my life. I understand your comments, but let me be a little bit mysterious and tell you that Marxian economists are a lot more numerous in the United States than you might imagine. And there's no difficulty in explaining why. It's dangerous. And so it's important not to be very open about that. I am in a special position, which is why you know me. And that's because I'm a graduate of the elite schools of the United States. And when confronted about my Marxism, I simply wave my pedigree, and in the United States, that works. And that's why you know of me and not of the many others that are there. I'm going to approach this a little differently. I'm going to begin by reminding us all of the decades leading up to World War I. That was a period of time when there was tremendous tension among the great powers of that time. The European countries, especially Germany versus Britain, with the United States playing a growing role, and tremendous tension, conflict, and eventually a terrible, perhaps the most terrible World War. Throughout that time, there were intense class struggles in every one of the contending superpowers. They were obvious, they were clear. It was capitalists versus socialists of one kind or another. And the lesson of that time was that the class struggles had their own dynamic, but they certainly helped shape the great power struggles, and vice versa. It was a complex interplay that produced what? A dramatic change in the whole class configurations in every one of the contesting countries. Russia went off in a new direction with the Soviet Revolution. There were similar efforts, as I'm sure many of you know, in many other parts of Europe around that time. That was where Georg Lukács comes from. That's where Antonio Gramsci comes from, Lenin, I mean, all of them. The whole Marxist canon was shaken to the core. Why am I telling you this story, which you know? Because I think something similar is going on now. And here the two key stories are the United States and China, with a secondary role played by Europe, as Yanis has taught us over the years, both by the roles he played and by the comments that he made. Here is what I think is going on. Let me preface it one more. Marx has a wonderful remark somewhere about no system disappears until it has exhausted all the forms in which it can function. That's a remarkable insight and lends itself nicely to what I want to say. Western capitalism, from its inception in England in the 17th century, or whenever you want to make the break, has gone through an immense array of forms. One of the most important, of course, the colonial form, when it was able and took this step to carve up the rest of the world, to feed it the raw materials, the food, and all the labor that it needed, the markets that it needed to expand beyond what it could, and that could at least postpone for a while the clash that it eventually worsened by virtue of that postponement. But there was a very powerful sequence of forms that it took. I think the United States and Europe are now at a point where they can't see and cannot envision the next form, which is becoming urgent because the form they're in looks like it's heading into the toilet. I think it is important to understand that they don't know where to go next or how to go. Yes, cloud computing, of course. The high-tech, one of the only sectors, certainly here in the United States, that looks anything other than dead or dying. And the terrible fear here is that the Chinese have caught up and are in the process of surpassing the US in just those areas. And that produces a very strange behavior. They can't provide work at a decent wage. Otherwise, there wouldn't be Donald Trump. He is the product of the failure to handle the last phase of the old system. When the U.S. capital left the United States, went to China, India, Brazil, all over, Vietnam, all over the place, and produced such a level of disorder in the United States that the conventional, comfortable politics of the Democratic and Republican Party collapsed. The middle dissolved. Meanwhile, something very similar was hollowing out capitalism in Europe. And Here is then my notion. What you are seeing in the effort of the United States is a desperate, and I use that word intentionally, and if it frightens you when I use it, that's partly why I'm using it. I can assure you that the American people feel now a sense of desperation about their situation and a sense of desperation about the Trump government a mere 2.5 months after it took over. It is a sense of a vortex, of a spinning out of control. Now, let me put that to the side, and my focus now is on China. China has outdeveloped the United States in the last 30 years. We all know that. The GDP growth that the IMF predicts for the United States this year is 2.5%, and most people don't think it'll make that. The Chinese predict 5%, and that 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 ratio has been the norm for decades now, and there is no suggestion that it will stop. This is a terrible problem. Number one. Number two, China has figured out how to make a socialism unlike the other socialisms that have so far been tried. For simplicity, let me distinguish very quickly European socialism, or what is sometimes called Scandinavian socialism, although obviously it doesn't apply very well to Scandinavia these days. And it was what? It was an economy that was basically privately capitalist, but with a fairly strong dose of government regulation, high levels of taxation, and the provision of a social welfare state, more or less adopted in Germany or France or Italy and so on. That was the first model. Second model, the Soviet Union. There, the government takes over everything in industry and a good chunk of agriculture and runs it like a state enterprise. China is neither of these. China decided to try something else, a hybrid, 50% one, 50% the other, with a strong government run by a strong communist party in order to control and shape and limit what this odd hybrid would do and how it would develop, leaning on Confucian ideas from the past and leaning on a pretty good critique of both the Scandinavian and the Soviet systems. So China was able to do what no other socialism was able to do. And its hybrid model outperformed every person's expectation. I wrote my master's thesis at Stanford University on the Chinese economy, many years ago. And the distance China has come, which I have followed ever since, is nothing short of spectacular. If you want to be a poor country that stops being poor, then China is the obvious model to use, and has been for years and will continue to be. And that's a very powerful social force to be able to say what I just said. But here comes the irony as I close. China, too, is at a point where, having gone through a variety of efforts, let me remind you, in the late 50s, the communes, that was my dissertation, was about communes in China in the early days of Mao. Then we have the Cultural Revolution, and we have all kinds of experiments, then the reversion back to letting people become rich, then the whole notion of a 50-50 private state. In a way, China finishes this by now stale debate of capitalism, the private versus the state. And it puts China at a point of questioning, I hope, its own class structure. And here, let me explain what I mean. I know that Marxism is interpreted in different ways. Like all great works of great thinkers, there are lots of interpretations. But when I read Marx's Capital, which, by the way, I have taught in American universities every year since the 1970s, my classes are full, and no one has ever interfered with me doing that. And I'm doing it now, this semester, as I talk to you. In my interpretation, the class structure Marx was interested in was the one that organizes the workplace between a tiny minority of people who are the capitalists, the employers, and all the others who aren't. The United States Census today says that the employers in this country represent 3% of the people. The other 97% are not. A revolution that Marx, therefore, foresees is an end to that way of organizing the workplace. So it isn't employers and employees. Why is this important? Because this is an earth-shaking change that would implicate both the United States and Europe on the one hand and China on the other. It is something they have in common, that way of organizing their enterprises. And that's what's got to change in both of them. They come at it from a different history, in different ways, with different consciousness. But the problem is the one Marx set himself. Let me close with a quote, since I'm a Marxist, you will forgive me, from Lenin. After the revolution, in the short number of years he had before he died, he made the following comment. What we have achieved, he said, is state capitalism. His words, the working class sees the state, and we now operate a capitalism. What we haven't done, but is our next stage, is to make use, and then he used this word, of worker cooperatives, which existed all over Russia at that time, as they existed elsewhere. That is the direction we have to go. Well, that's, of course, a recognition that the problem is the employer-employee relationship, and the genuine democratization of the workplace is the agenda for revolutionaries. And when I ask myself, what alternative story could I tell rather than the one in which the United States keeps provoking the Chinese with one limit, with one exclusion, with one sanction after another? And I'm mindful today that Mr. Trump has discovered the concept of the secondary sanction. He used it at first for Venezuela. Here's what it means. Anybody who buys oil or gas from Venezuela will now be subject to a sanction. And he specifically threatened Russia and China. China gets a lot from Venezuela, if you're not familiar with that he would apply it. These are steps which, to go back to my beginning in World War I, led to one of the worst wars the human race has ever had. I wish I were as sanguine as Yanis about the prospects for that. I'm real worried. But then again, I live here. And as I watch the sinking of Europe, I get worried. And as a Marxist, I need to understand how and where I can think about a class change in both of the conflicting countries that I might be able to advance as a place for both of them to go, other than the mutual slaughter that these people are capable of. And believe me, when I tell you that the leadership in this country was under Biden and is under Trump capable, do not forget we remain the only country that ever dropped a nuclear bomb on other people. It should not be forgotten. Last point. When Yanis tells us, as he does, and I couldn't agree more, about the sad, tragic, and I use tragedy in its Greek origins, of Europe, let's remember how much of the world Europe dominated for so long. And look where it is now, desperately trying to hold on with its fingernails as it falls down the cliff. There is something unspeakably sad, and yet also there's an element of justice. That empire, or those empires, are over, unquestionably done. They passed the baton to the United States, which is now, for the first time, feeling itself in the last 15 years that its empire is also dissolving. That is what makes Trump so crazy, so extreme in what he's doing. He's throwing around tariffs. It's a lifeline for him. It's a magic wand that will somehow make the disparate parts that Yanis sketched for us come together. Here in the United States, here's my last point. We have a metaphor we often use. It comes out of the American game of football. When you're losing and you're in the final seconds of a football game, the team that is about to lose often chooses to tell the quarterback, throw a Hail Mary pass. What that means is you throw the ball to a predetermined corner of the field, you tell all your players to run down there, you throw it down there, and you hope as it bounces around, it comes down in the hands of someone on your team rather than the other team. You know what it means? It means you've given up rational policy, rational strategy. It's all a matter of luck. Our government throws Hail Mary passes. People like Yanis and me try to make a rational strategy. It's right for us to try, but it misunderstands where we are if we don't realize that they've given that up. They are now in desperation mode, and the class struggle I think we need to wage is to tell them that the solutions to the problems on both sides might well be to question the organization of production in just the way Marx originally tried to get us to do.
Thank you so much, Rick. And I apologize to everyone for the artificiality of this moderation, but given that we have all these different time zones going on, before we open it up to those of us who don't have these time constraints, I'm just wondering if, Yanis, do you have a question for Rick before you turn in for the night?
I just want to say goodbye, and I want to say that, I agree with everything that Rick said. And since he asked me to ask the question, I'll ask him one more or less in jest. But isn't the Hail Mary strategy, at the moment when you feel you're losing the game anyway, the only rational strategy that is available?
Yes.
So
And
Hail Marys when you've reached a situation where China is more than twice as productive as you are in terms of manufacturing sector, and where it's all a matter of preserving your rents when you don't have, and they know that. Trump is at least honest in that. The United States no longer has the productive capacity, not even to build nuclear submarines, let alone super fast trains. So their Hail Mary strategy of maintaining for another 10, 20, 30 years, if they can, the hegemony of the dollar while devaluing it and continuing to accumulate some rents. Well, this is the best they can do. The question is, what will the American people do? Because they are going to be sold down the drain, whether that Hail Mary works or not. If it works, they will still be thrown.
well, someone at the beginning, I believe, mentioned Hegel. And what Yanis does as a good student of Hegel too, is remind us, quite rightly, that the irrational is the rational. It's not either or. It is that strange combination, which is the only way to understand all of these things. It reminds me of when people here say about something that happened, it happened for no reason. The Russians invaded Ukraine for no reason, an unprovoked attack, as if that exists. Every attack is provoked. You either understand it and find the provocation, or you avoid it. But the notion that it isn't there, that says something about your reasoning if you understand what Hegel taught us. And I want to come back. Yes, the class struggle is getting very intense here in the United States. We have a revival of our labor movement, the likes of which we haven't seen for 75, 80 years. We have a revival of the left. Every Saturday now, there are mass demonstrations in front of Elon Musk's Tesla showrooms. You can't buy a Tesla here. You can't get through the demonstrators to get into the room to negotiate the purchase. The government has to promise severe penalties to people who deface the Tesla on the street, which they're of course doing anyway. They can't stop it. There are movements here again. I don't know how long I will be able to speak freely anymore, because things are really, Yanis knows he's had to live through these half a dozen times. But for Americans, this is very frightening. You hear the word fascism in this country more often now than I have for a long, long time.